The first real clue wasn't the pregnancy test. It was the way Corinne came home from Sabrina's bachelorette weekend and acted like the missing night was nothing. Same purse, same perfume, same wedding ring on her finger, but something about her was off. Like she had walked back into our house already practicing a version of the truth I wasn't supposed to question. We argued before she even left. I was in the kitchen with Bennett's homework spread across the table, trying to help him fix a science worksheet about planets when Corinne came in dressed like she was going to be gone longer than she had told me. Hair done, makeup sharp, phone in her hand, overnight bag by the door. I looked at the bag first, then at her and asked, "I thought this was dinner and drinks." She didn't even blink. She said Sabrina wanted the girls to stay downtown, maybe one night, maybe two, nothing serious. That was the first time my stomach tightened, because Corinne didn't usually drop plans like that at the last minute. She was the type to tell me what restaurant, what time, who was driving, even what she thought she might order. That night, suddenly, everything was casual. I told her I didn't like it. Not because I thought a married woman had to sit in the house and ask for permission to breathe, but because we had a kid upstairs, a marriage, routines, responsibilities. I said, "There's a difference between going out with friends and acting like you're single for a weekend." She snapped so fast it almost felt prepared. "I'm not owned, Malcolm." I remember looking toward the stairs because Bennett was up there brushing his teeth, and I didn't want him hearing his parents fight. I lowered my voice and told her this wasn't about control. She laughed once, cold and short, and said, "That's exactly what men call it when they don't get their way." Then she grabbed her bag like the whole conversation had insulted her, not the other way around. She left without hugging Bennett goodnight. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I stood in the kitchen for a few seconds after the door closed, listening to the house settle around me, and I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. People have bad arguments. People say things because they're annoyed. So I went upstairs, tucked Bennett in, helped him remember which planet had rings, and acted normal because that was my job that night. Corinne texted once around 10 p.m. that she had made it downtown, and after that, nothing. I didn't chase her. I didn't call 20 times. I sat on the couch with the TV on low, checking my phone more than I should have, pretending I wasn't waiting for a sound in the driveway. She came back the next afternoon wearing the same confidence she left with, but not the same energy. Her eyes were tired, and she moved carefully, like she didn't want to give me too much to notice. I asked, "Long night?" She dropped her bag by the island and said, "Yeah, we stayed at the hotel. Nobody wanted to drive." I said, "You didn't mention a hotel." She shrugged and opened the fridge like she had already decided the conversation was over. Plans changed. That answer sat wrong immediately. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. Corinne was never vague unless she was annoyed or hiding something, and this didn't feel like annoyance. This felt like she had shortened the story because a longer one would have holes in it. For the next few days, she gave me more of those little shortened stories. She was on her phone more, but not in the normal way. She angled the screen away when I walked past. She smiled at messages and killed the smile when she noticed me. At dinner, Bennett told her about the model rocket we were trying to build for school, and she said, "That's nice," without really hearing him. I watched her across the table while she pushed food around her plate and checked her phone under the edge of the table like a teenager. I wanted to ask directly, but some part of me didn't want the answer yet. That's the ugly part, I'll admit. For a few days, I hoped I was wrong, because being wrong would have been easier than being right. Then, one night, I walked into the kitchen and caught her laughing quietly at her screen. Not a big laugh, not something obvious, just this private little smile that disappeared the second she saw me. I asked, "Who's that?" She said, "Sabrina," too quickly, and turned toward the sink like washing a glass suddenly mattered. I stood there waiting for her to add something, anything, but she didn't. She just kept her back to me. That was when I stopped asking myself whether something had changed. I knew something had changed, I just didn't know how bad it was yet. About 2 weeks after that weekend, Corinne told me she was pregnant. No excitement, no happy tears, no walking into the room with a test in her hand like it meant something good for us. She said it in the kitchen while pouring water, like she was telling me we were almost out of paper towels. I looked at her hand, then at her face, and asked how far along she thought she was. She paused before answering, and it was not a normal pause. It was the kind of pause people take when the truth is standing right there and they're trying to step around it. Then she said, "A few weeks," and I felt the whole room go quiet in a way I still remember. I asked her to say it again because I wanted to hear how it sounded when she had to look at me. Corinne held the glass with both hands and said, "It's yours, Malcolm." She said the words, but she didn't land them. Her eyes moved off my face halfway through, and that was the part I couldn't ignore. I knew our timeline, I knew when we had been close, and I knew when we hadn't. I also knew that the one weekend she suddenly stopped explaining herself was sitting right in the middle of it. I said, "That lines up pretty close to Sabrina's party." Her face changed so fast I almost missed it. It wasn't guilt exactly, not at first. It was anger, like I had walked into a room I wasn't supposed to know existed. She put the glass down and said, "Don't start with that." I told her I wasn't starting anything. I was asking a basic question. She said I was being disgusting, insecure, controlling, all the same words she had used before she left that night. I let her talk because the more she pushed those words at me, the less she sounded offended and the more she sounded scared. For a second, I almost backed off. I did. I remember standing there in our kitchen, hearing Bennett's cartoons playing low in the living room, and thinking maybe I was turning a bad argument into something worse because I didn't want to feel stupid. That thought stayed for about 5 seconds. Then Corinne looked me in the eye and said, "You're really going to ruin this pregnancy because of your ego?" That did something to me. Not because it hurt, although it did, but because she had taken a question about the truth and tried to turn it into a defect in me. That was when I stopped hoping she would make it make sense. That night, her phone buzzed on the nightstand while she was in the shower. I didn't dig through it. I didn't need to. The screen lit up with no saved name, just a number, and the preview said, "Still thinking about that night." I stood there long enough to read it twice, then I turned the phone over and walked away. My hands were shaking a little, which annoyed me because I didn't want to give her that kind of power over me. When she came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the edge of the bed pretending to check email, and she acted normal. That was almost worse than the message. She climbed into bed beside me like there wasn't another man somewhere texting her about a night she was still trying to fold into our marriage. The next morning, I called Desmond Hale from my truck before work. Desmond wasn't some dramatic movie detective. He was a quiet guy I knew from years back, the kind of person who asked direct questions and didn't fill the silence with opinions. I gave him the number, the hotel name, and the date of the Bachelorette weekend. He asked me what I wanted. I said, "I want facts, not guesses, not feelings, facts." He told me to send everything over, and I did. After that, I went into work and answered emails like I wasn't waiting for the floor to drop out from under my life. Corinne got sloppy after that, or maybe I was just watching better. She started stepping outside for calls, always with the same low voice and the same quick hang-up when I came near. One evening, I walked onto the back patio while she was turned toward the yard, phone pressed close to her ear. I heard her say, "I told you it's handled. He doesn't know." She spun around so fast, she almost dropped the phone. I asked, "Who doesn't know what?" She said, "Work." Before she even had time to think of a better lie, I looked at her and said, "Say his name." She stared at me, and for the first time since this started, she didn't have a clean answer ready. 2 days later, Desmond called while I was sitting in my truck outside the grocery store. He didn't waste time. The number belonged to Graham Vale, a regional sales director who had been at the same hotel that night for a corporate event. Desmond had confirmed Corinne left Sabrina's party floor around midnight and took the elevator up instead of going back to her room. She didn't come back down until morning. Graham checked out late around the same time. I sat there with one hand on the steering wheel, listening to him talk, and the strangest part was that I didn't feel surprised. I felt embarrassed that some part of me had still wanted a different answer. I stayed in that grocery store parking lot longer than I needed to because I didn't trust myself to drive right away. Not because I was going to do something stupid, but because the proof had taken all the noise out of it. Before Desmond called, there was still that small, miserable space where Corinne could have explained something. After that call, there was no space left. She had left a party, gone upstairs to another man's floor, stayed there until morning, then came home and stood in my kitchen, acting like I was the problem for noticing. I didn't confront her that night. That probably sounds strange, but once I had the timeline, I didn't want a screaming match in our living room with Bennett upstairs pretending not to listen. I wanted her calm enough to lie clearly, because clear lies tell you more than panic does. So I came home with groceries, asked Bennett about school, and watched Corinne move around the kitchen like we were just a regular family making dinner. She even asked me if I wanted her to pick up more coffee the next day. That little normal question almost got to me because she said it like she hadn't been managing me for weeks, like she hadn't been letting me help our son with homework while she was carrying a lie around the house and calling it privacy. The next day, I told her we were going to dinner. She gave me this suspicious look and said, "Since when do you plan date nights out of nowhere?" I said, "Since now," and left it there. I picked a restaurant downtown, quiet enough that we could talk, public enough that she couldn't turn the whole thing into a performance. She dressed nicely, too nicely maybe, like she thought we were about to smooth things over. For the first 15 minutes, she played normal better than I expected. She asked about Bennett's project. She complained about traffic. She smiled at the waiter. I sat across from her watching the woman I married try to wear the face she used to have. When the drinks came, I waited until the waiter walked away. Then I said, "Who is Graham Vale?" Her hand stopped halfway to her glass. It was small, but it was enough. She said, "I don't know anyone by that name," and she said it too fast, with that same sharp little edge she used when she wanted me to feel guilty for asking. I nodded and said, "Corporate event, same hotel, top floor, same night Sabrina had her party." This time, she didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved over my shoulder like she was checking who could hear us, and that was the first honest thing she had done in weeks. She wasn't shocked that I knew. She was scared of where I had learned it. She leaned forward and whispered, "Malcolm, do not do this here." I said, "Then where did you want to do it? At home while Bennett eats cereal in the next room?" Her face tightened, and for a second the anger came back because anger was easier for her than shame. She told me I was embarrassing her. I told her she had embarrassed herself before I ever said his name. That hit harder than I expected it to. She looked down at the table, and the confidence drained out of her so quickly it almost looked like exhaustion. I asked her one more time, calmly, "Did you leave that party and go upstairs with him?" She swallowed, looked at her wine, and said, "It was one night." That sentence did more damage than any denial would have. One night, like giving it a smaller label, could make it smaller inside my house. She started talking then, fast and low, saying she had been drinking, saying everyone was acting wild, saying she felt ignored at home, saying it didn't mean anything. I let her keep going until she ran out of excuses. Then I said, "You came home, lied to my face, and tried to hand me another man's child like it was mine." She flinched at that. Not because it was cruel, because it was plain. She said, "We don't know that yet." I said, "Then we're going to know." She stared at me like she was finally realizing I hadn't brought her there to argue. I had brought her there to hear herself say it before the legal part started. She asked, "So what? You're just done?" I put cash on the table because I didn't want to wait for the check. I told her I wasn't making a decision in that restaurant. I had already made it in a parking lot with my hand on the steering wheel, listening to another man's name become part of my marriage. When I stood up, she grabbed my wrist and said, "Please don't make this ugly." I looked down at her hand until she let go, then said, "You made it ugly, I'm making it clear." I walked out before she could shrink it into another mistake. I drove for almost an hour after I left that restaurant, not because I had somewhere to go, but because I needed enough road between me and Corinne to think without hearing her voice. My phone kept lighting up in the cup holder. Calls first, then texts, then the kind of messages people send when they realize begging is not going to work and they switch back to blame. She wrote that I humiliated her, that I ambushed her, that I was acting like a stranger. I remember laughing once at that one, not because it was funny, but because after what she had done, the part she couldn't forgive was me saying the truth out loud in a room where someone might have noticed her face change. The next morning, I called Claudia Merritt, a divorce attorney Desmond had recommended years before when another friend of ours had gone through something ugly. Claudia was calm in a way that made me calm too. I gave her the whole thing in order, not emotionally, just the facts. The weekend, the hotel, the messages, Graham, the pregnancy, the timeline. She didn't interrupt me. When I finished, she said, "Do you want to fight or do you want control?" I told her I wanted control because I had already wasted enough time waiting for Corinne to tell the truth. Claudia said, "Then stop talking to her about feelings. Protect the money, document everything, and get the paternity issue handled immediately." That sentence snapped me into a different mode. By lunch, I had moved half of our joint savings into an account only I could access. I didn't hide it. I didn't drain her. I protected what I legally could before she had a chance to turn panic into damage. I changed passwords, copied statements, saved every message, and sent Claudia the hotel information Desmond had gathered. None of it felt good. People act like taking control feels powerful, but honestly, it felt sick. I was sitting at my desk doing bank transfers while a picture Bennett had drawn of our family was still taped to my office wall, and I kept staring at the 3 stick figures like I was trying to figure out when one of them had stopped being real. When I got home, Corinne was waiting in the living room with her arms folded, still trying to look angry enough to stay in charge. She asked where I had been, why I wasn't answering her, and whether I understood how cruel I was being. I set my keys down and told her I had spoken to an attorney. That did what the restaurant hadn't fully done. Her face didn't just tighten, it dropped. She said, "You already got a lawyer?" I said, "Yes." She started pacing and saying we didn't need to involve lawyers, that married people made mistakes, that Bennett deserved 2 parents who could work through things. I told her Bennett deserved a home where the truth wasn't being dragged around behind locked phone screens. Then I told her I wanted a DNA test. Corinne stopped pacing. For about 2 seconds, the whole room froze around that sentence. She said, "You don't trust me at all." I looked at her and said, "That's a strange thing to say after you admitted you slept with Graham." She flinched like I had used a dirty word instead of his name. Then she switched tactics and softened her voice, which was worse than the anger. She told me she was scared, that she had felt lonely, that she didn't know how to fix what she had done. I almost felt something when she said that. I'm not going to pretend I was made of stone. But then she put one hand on her stomach and said, "This baby could still be yours, and you're punishing both of us before you even know." That was when whatever sympathy I had almost felt went cold again. I told her the test was happening either way, and she could cooperate or let the lawyers handle it. She sat down like her legs had gone weak, but even then, she was still trying to negotiate the shape of the truth. She said, "If it is yours, can we stop all this?" I said, "No. If it's mine, I'll take responsibility for my child. That doesn't erase what you did." She looked at me like that answer had offended her more than the divorce itself. I think that was the first moment she understood the old version of me was not coming back just because she cried in the living room. The test took 10 days, and those 10 days were some of the strangest days of my life. Corinne floated around the house acting half guilty and half hopeful, like the result might magically turn betrayal into a rough patch. Bennett knew something was wrong, even if he didn't know the details, so I kept things steady for him. School, dinner, homework, bedtime. That became my job. Not fixing Corinne, not calming her, not listening to her rewrite the story in softer words. On the 10th day, Claudia called while I was sitting in my truck outside Bennett's school waiting for pickup. She didn't stretch it out. She just said, "Malcolm, you are not the father." And I sat there watching parents walk their kids across the parking lot while the last piece of my marriage came loose in my hands. When Claudia said I wasn't the father, I didn't cry, I didn't yell, and I didn't feel relieved in the clean way people might expect. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, watching Bennett come out of school with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, and I felt this heavy, ugly confirmation settle in. Part of me had known. Another part of me had still been holding on to the smallest chance that the test would give me a different kind of problem. But it didn't. It gave me the exact problem I had been preparing for. I picked Bennett up like normal because he didn't deserve to have his afternoon turned into a scene. He got in the truck talking about a classmate who had spilled glue on his desk, and I nodded along while my head was somewhere else completely. That was one of the strangest things about that whole period. The worst news of your life can land at 3 p.m. And 20 minutes later, you still have to ask your kid if he wants chicken nuggets or leftover pasta. I took him home, helped him wash his hands, and made dinner like my marriage hadn't officially crossed some line I could never uncross. Corinne was in the living room when I came in, and she knew before I said anything. I don't know if it was my face or the way I didn't take off my jacket, but she stood up slowly and asked, "What did it say?" I told Bennett to go set up his homework in the kitchen, then I waited until he was out of the room. Corinne kept staring at me, breathing shallow, like if she stared hard enough she could change the answer before I spoke. I said, "It's not mine." She closed her eyes and sat back down like the air had gone out of her. For once, she didn't deny it. She didn't call me insecure. She didn't say I was twisting things. She just sat there with the truth sitting between us, and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Then she tried to save herself. Not the marriage, herself. She said, "Malcolm, please. I know what this looks like, but we can still figure something out. I asked her what there was to figure out. She said Bennett needed his mother, that we had built a life, that one mistake should not erase years. I told her, you keep calling it one mistake because that sounds easier than saying you lied every day after it. Her mouth tightened, and I could see she wanted to fight back, but she didn't have the room anymore. The DNA result had taken the last soft place out of the conversation. I told her Claudia had already prepared the filing and that she would be served the next morning. That was when panic finally broke through the shame. Corinne stood up fast and said, "You filed already?" I said yes. She looked around the living room like she was seeing the house differently, like the walls and furniture had suddenly stopped belonging to her in the way she assumed they always would. Then she asked about the bank accounts. I told her I had protected my half and documented everything. She laughed once, bitter and shaky, and said, "So you planned all of this behind my back?" I said, "I prepared while you were still lying to my face." That line hit her hard because she couldn't turn it around. She tried, but it didn't work. She called me cold. She said I was enjoying this. She said I wanted to punish her because my pride was hurt. I let her say it because I had already learned something by then. When people lose control of the facts, they start attacking your reaction to the facts. I told her she could stay somewhere else while the lawyers worked through the details. She asked where she was supposed to go. I looked at her for a second, and I hated how calm I sounded when I said, "That is not my job anymore." She left that night with a suitcase, her phone, and that same overnight bag she had carried out the night everything started. That detail stuck with me more than it should have. Same bag, different ending. Bennett asked where his mom was going, and I told him she needed to stay with a friend for a while because grown-up things were being handled. I didn't dump adult pain on him. I didn't poison him against her, but I also didn't pretend everything was fine because kids know when adults are lying. He nodded, quiet, and sat closer to me on the couch than usual. The divorce moved faster than Corinne expected. Claudia had the DNA result, Desmond's timeline, the messages, the hotel confirmation, and the financial records lined up clean. Corinne's first lawyer tried to make noise about reconciliation and emotional pressure, but there wasn't much to work with. She had no stable plan, no clean explanation, and no way to make the timeline look innocent. The house stayed with me. Primary custody stayed with me. Corinne got scheduled time with Bennett, and I made sure those exchanges stayed calm because my son was not going to become another place where she could create damage. The part Corinne didn't prepare for was how quickly her version of the story stopped working. Sabrina let her stay for a while, but that arrangement fell apart once the truth started leaking through their friend group. Graham disappeared almost immediately, which surprised nobody except maybe Corinne. He didn't want the baby, didn't want the scandal, and definitely didn't want to be tied to the wreckage after the fun part was over. Corinne had thought she could keep one night separate from the rest of her life. Instead, that one night followed her into every room she tried to hide in. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, Corinne asked to meet me for coffee. I picked a place near the courthouse, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because it was public, simple, and easy to leave. She looked different when she walked in. Not destroyed, not some movie version of regret, just tired in a way she couldn't cover with makeup anymore. She sat across from me and said, "Thank you for coming," like we were two reasonable adults handling something small. I told her to say what she needed to say. She started with the apology I expected. She said she messed up, she said she never thought it would go that far, and she said the night with Graham was stupid and empty. I let her talk for a minute because I wanted to see if she could say one thing without shrinking it. Then she said, "I lost everything," and I finally answered. I said, "You didn't lose it, Corinne, you traded it." She looked down at her hands, and for the first time, she didn't have a comeback ready. That silence felt more honest than any apology she had given me. She asked for more time with Bennett. I told her she would get the time in the agreement, consistently, without games. She didn't like that word, consistently, because it meant she couldn't just appear when guilt hit and disappear when life got hard. She tried one more time to talk about us, about the years we had, about the home we built, about how people survive worse things. I told her I missed who I thought she was, but I wasn't going back to live with who she had shown me she could be. That was plain, and it hurt coming out, but it was true. Graham was already gone by then. Desmond told me later he had left the city, changed jobs, and made sure he was difficult to reach. Corinne had to deal with the pregnancy, the money problems, the friend group turning cold, and the fact that the man she risked everything for wanted no part of the aftermath. The child from that night was placed for adoption quietly through arrangements I didn't involve myself in. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't feel like I had won. Winning would have been my wife coming home from that weekend with nothing to hide. Life after that got smaller before it got better. That part matters because people like to skip straight to the rebuilt ending. But the middle is mostly school pickups, awkward custody exchanges, bills, quiet dinners, and trying not to let one person's choices turn you bitter. Bennett adjusted slowly. Some nights he asked questions I had to answer carefully, and some nights he didn't ask anything at all. I never made Corinne a monster to him, but I also didn't lie and call everything fine. He deserved stability, not a fake story designed to make adults feel less guilty. Later, I started seeing Juliet Marlowe. Slowly. I told her early on that I wasn't looking for chaos, and she didn't try to rush me into pretending I was healed just because the paperwork was finished. She met Bennett only after enough time had passed, and even then, we kept it simple. Dinner, board games, ordinary things. That was what I wanted by then. Ordinary started to feel like peace after living through weeks where every phone buzz felt like another lie waiting to be found. The final decree didn't make me happy. It made things clear. That was enough. I kept the house, kept my routine with Bennett, and built a life where nobody had to hide a screen when I walked into the room. Corinne didn't disappear completely because she was still Bennett's mother, but she became part of a schedule instead of part of my home. And I'll be honest, that was the cleanest ending I was going to get. Not pretty, not painless, but clean. Years later, Bennett asked me if I ever missed her. We were outside in the yard, and Juliet was inside setting plates on the table, nothing special going on. I told him, I miss the life I thought we had. I don't miss the lie that came with it. He nodded like he understood more than I wanted him to have to understand. I watched him go back to what he was doing, and I realized that peace doesn't always feel big when it arrives. Sometimes it just feels like a quiet house, a steady kid, and no more pretending. If this story hit you, please like it, share it with someone who would understand, and subscribe for more real, emotional stories about betrayal, consequences, and starting over. I appreciate everyone who listens all the way through because stories like this are not just about cheating. They are about what happens when somebody thinks they can manage the truth forever and then finds out they can't. What would you have done when the hotel timeline came out? Would you have confronted Corinne immediately, or would you have waited for the DNA test first? And do you think Malcolm handled the custody and divorce the right way, or was he too cold once the truth was confirmed?